most of the things I'm interested in are things that people might think are fairly small and minor in the face of things happening in the world, and indeed in many ways they are. But I'm really fascinated in all things Manx, particularly things to do with music, with words, with snippets of history, with stories of people. And I was trying to think how I could combine these things together to make a talk in the end. So mostly I'm going to be talking to you on the subject of fairy music. But I thought, well, I can't just talk to you about that. I'm going to have to produce some music, so I've got my long-suffering husband hiding here to produce at some point, and I might have a go myself later on. Now, the quote, the hearing, the wavelets murmur, of course, comes from that well-known Manx song. Brilliant. And this is from the second verse, and I was thinking, wavelets, okay, very Victorian, mid-Victorian words there. Small waves, ripples, elusive. Well, fairy music, really. That's my theme. That's how I'm going to go into it. Fairy music. Well, whether you believe such things or not is fairly irrelevant because we come from people who did. And to me, this area is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to be jumping about a bit in time and place. Just try and bear with me. I'm trying to follow a script so I don't carry on for 3 hours because I don't find talking a problem. I'm already off the script. In Gaelic Scotland and Ireland, there are many songs, music about kelpies, seal women, fairy hills, and the such like. And I remember when I was quite young thinking, well, surely we must have a small portion of fairy type music. And I'm using the word fairy here, sort of sort of covering all manner of strange supernatural beings, so to speak. And of course we do have our fairy tunes. You're going to hear a few and about some of the people who played them, some of the people who heard them, some of the people who actually got these written down at some point or passed them on in very different forms, and we're still doing that. I'm a musician and a writer, and part of what I do, I think, is to try and think out the things that have been passed down to me in various forms might go out to other people. Anyway, let's get some background. We can't mention fairy tunes without first mention of the fiddlers, fairy and human, and indeed fiddles. Now you might note that's got 3 strings, and of course there is a history of three-stringed fiddles being played on the island. I don't know exactly when that was. It was a long time ago. And one fiddle would be the drone fiddle. But of course, this is a 3-stringed fiddle because it's lost a string or snapped it. So the fiddle, of course, is the traditional instrument of the Manx. And the fiddler is the person who's going to be in the greatest demand at weddings, playing in barns over Christmas. Some of the players of fairy tunes were also very big people in the chapels, and they played for carvel or sung the traditional carvels as well, the religious songs sung on Eel Faery around that time. And there didn't seem to be any particular tension between between those two sides of things. One such fiddler was the wonderfully named Willie the Faery. Which gives you an idea of why he might have been known there in this context. He was William Kane of Renas, that's Glen Helen now, and he was going home across the mountains near Brooks Park when he heard music down in the glen, and he stopped to listen. And then he went home to practice the new tune on the fiddle. And this is the pattern. This is what these fairy fiddlers do. A special regard would be given to those who had access to fairy tunes as opposed to the common or garden sort of tunes. And there are more players of fairy music and more tunes of that sort than you might imagine. Okay, as a fiddler, where might you go to find this elusive fairy music? Well, these days you'd probably have access to written sources, or you go online, of course, if you wanted to get some good fairy tunes. In previous centuries, you could perhaps try some places like this: rivers, pools, hills, the seaside, anywhere where you would sort of imagine you might get a bit of inspiration. I write poetry, and every good Learn How to Be a Poet book, and there are such things, I tell you to get out walking in the country. I've just had it confirmed from David Callan, brilliant poet there, that this is indeed what he does to get inspiration. So why should it be any different for people who are looking for fairy tunes? Inspiration tends to come. However, if you wish to find and play this wonderful fairy music yourself, it does help to be a man. It does help to bear the surname Kane. There seem to be an awful lot of people with that surname, and they're not all related. And ideally you need to be a fiddle player, clarinets, trumpet players, blowers of horns, and even the humble tin whistle. You're not excluded from accessing or playing this material. Now, you wouldn't perhaps expect to hear fairy music in Douglas. And this picture, by the way, is from, I think, the mid-1600s. But the earliest mention, or one of the earliest mentions of encountering this beautiful fairy music, comes not from a Manxman, but an Englishman who was forced to cross the river at High Tide in Douglas in the 1700s. I think it was about 1730. So this is 100 years or so later on from this time, but you get the idea. He was on his horse, and the horse was well able to cross the river. On hearing this extraordinary music, both the man and the horse were transfixed, and they stood in the middle of the river for over 3/4 of an hour. And the man, who had been a skeptic and dismissive of Manx superstition, was completely converted after that. Now, dusk is a prime time for coming across fairy music, but you should take care. I mean, look what happened to the character who followed the music into the fairy hill. It was years before he got out and everything had changed. And as for the one who never came back, well, doesn't seem to have been a major obstacle, though, for many fiddlers who became strongly associated with particular songs and couldn't wait to perform them. Often in places like this, hilarious concerts that the associated Manx cultural activists of the late 19th century and the early 20th century were prone to putting on. They just loved somebody coming to do a fairy song for you. Sometimes, as happened in Douglas there, fairy music comes to you whether you want it or not, and you just have to listen, and sometimes you'd rather not, as in this story from 1892. The fairies at Ballacrane were making a terrible racket, and there was this poor old man, very tired and wanting to sleep after a hard day's work. And he was just dozing off when he heard the horrible sound of crunk, crunk, for the fairies were putting the strings on their fiddle in order. Even worse, it was a damp evening and the strings were even worse. And so was their crank, crank. And the poor fellow was desperate. He was desperate for sleep. What was he going to do? A bright thought struck him. He should humour them. So although his limbs were stiff with rheumatics, quoting here, he hobbles out of bed feeling very cold, and he begins dancing about cheerily, saying, "Play away, I'm dancing." And they do, of course. I'm glad to tell you that the old man didn't collapse as a result of this, but he was pretty done for fairly soon. Well, they carried on playing and then stopped eventually and made a polite bow. And at that moment, the room filled with clear light and the man fell asleep. The fairies and the fiddles disappeared and the old man had a beautiful dream. And never again was he disturbed by the fairies. So the moral, if there is a moral, is, go for it. It might just work out. Okay, Phil. Now, these days, if you don't want to go wandering about up some hills or ploughing through a river on a horse or dancing till you drop, and you want to find out more about this sort of thing, well, there is masses of material online and in published books. These were just things I grabbed from a bookcase. There are loads more there. Lots of information in old newspaper records at the Eye Museum. And of course, Culture Vannin, brilliant job, and many other places. I'm indebted, and I mention this here rather than at the end, to the numerous researchers whose particular research in these fairy areas, in these areas of music, both in the past and currently, I've referred to a lot. I should mention Stephen Miller in particular. He knows I'm doing this tonight. And Bob Carswell, Chloe Woolley, Fenella Bayes and George Broderick, James Franklin, and many others, of course. And then, of course, we get to the assorted 19th and 20th century collectors of the music and words themselves. We've got A.W. Moore there, a little more about him in a minute. Without them, we wouldn't be able to have this talk. We wouldn't be playing, probably, a lot of the music we do. It's about time we started with some music. I've talked about it for a while. We're going to have a tune with a great name and a great player. This tune comes from the Faeries in the north. It's called Wonderscope. It's the name, it was taken from the fairies at Christmas in Glenolden in 1898. And the informant, Thomas Kinraid, said that a man called William Keowna, maybe, used to play the tune 60 years previously, so that puts it back to 1830s. He would be going from house to house at Christmas, as people did, so that was the way the tunes moved around at that time. I should say I arranged this tune that Phil's going to play in a minute for my sister's wedding many years ago. And they went down the aisle flat out because I forgot to write slow and stately on the music. And it looked like a jig. And it could be a jig. Probably was a jig. Tunes go their own way, though, and here's Phil to do his own way. We're just playing short pieces of music here. It's not a concert. I can't say we've rehearsed for days. We haven't. So this is Wonderscope. Oh, yeah.
Never played the fiddle with me glasses on before, so it could have sounded all wrong.
As I was saying previously to that, we wouldn't have these tunes if it was not for these particular gentlemen you're going to show on the next slide. which is quite busy, and I apologise. These are the 19th century, the late 19th century collectors of Manx music. It's a bit confusing. What they do, what they produce, overlaps, similar names, but I will be mentioning them now and again. I'll just very quickly. The Gill brothers at the top, WH, is the one you'll hear more about, I think. He is the main person when we're talking about the Manx national songs. More about that in a minute. His brother there, Deemster Gill, went with WH, Willie Gill, and Dr. Clegg around the island in the 1890s to try and collect what was left of what were they perceived as a dying culture in many ways, musically. They initially worked sort of as a team, with Gill and Clegg being the main ones who actually transcribed the music. They went round the houses. They didn't stay quite as the team was envisaged, because deciding what happened next after you've got all this huge archive, these huge collections, was quite contentious. And A.W. Moore, of course, pretty much did everything in the Isle of Man at the period. He was a bit of a one-off in this. Amongst the many, many things he did as an antiquarian, as a politician, was compile a book of Manx music and ballads. And it came out in 1896, the same year as W.H. Gill's Manx national songs came out. So maybe not good timing, who got there first. His book is rather different because his words are in Manx as well as English, as taken down. Gill got English translators, English librettists to come in and write new words if he didn't think the Manx words were up to it, and they often weren't. And Gill had parlour arrangements, and as I say, A.W. Moore did have piano arrangements, but much more simple. Try and keep that in mind. Dr. Clegg there, the music that was collected by the three of them, the two Gills and Clegg, was known as, and still is, as the Clegg collection, but it incorporated as much material, perhaps more from the Gills as well. Anyway, don't worry about that. I will mention them when we need to. We'll go to the next slide, please, Phil. Okay. This is relevant to people who write, people who produce music. If you've got something precious, rare, what do you do with it? Do you hand it on, and how? Do you make it for the people of your time? How can you know what the future will want? If you're a creative type, you might find it quite hard to leave well alone. Interesting. What language do you use? If you've collected things in Manx and most of the population has given up that language, is there anything to be gained from keeping that going? Do you put it in English? What kind of English? Is it the sort of English we like in the songs? That varies, doesn't it? I doubt some of the language of the Manx National Songbook, murmuring wavelets and this sort of thing, not the sort of language we would tend to use these days. Let's talk about music. Is it going to be arranged? Over-arranged? Not arranged at all? One instrument? 20? I don't know. Who are you aiming at? Antiquarians? People who are going to sit in the library and look at lots of issues? Why? And I'm just going to leave those things floating about, but they are relevant, particularly to the people I was just discussing, and indeed to people who are working with Manx music these days too. Phil. And there, of course, is the good old Manx National Songs, W.H. Gill's book, which was one of the results coming from the collecting efforts of the Gill brothers and Dr. Clegg, but mainly it's Willie Gill's baby very much. He arranged the pieces, the piano arrangements. He was the one that asked, that sent the various librettos there. It was very popular, as you know, and subsequently, and some of these songs have definitely lasted. Manx Fisherman's Evening Song always brings tears to the eyes, still, in spite of me thinking it shouldn't. I love the Manx Wedding, the energy and the fun of it. Interesting. But not everybody liked this sort, even then, liked this sort of treatment of folk music. And was it folk music at all by the time words had changed, the music, bits had been added and taken away? Was it folk music at all? And what about those fairy tunes? Well, here's one. Yeah, this is from the Manx National Songbook, but there's not a lot of fairy music in it. Here's the Faeries Dance, which often appears on recordings on records actually from the 50s and 60s and 70s. I'm talking about the 1950s, 60s and 70s here. It seemed to have been quite popular with Manx choirs for a while. It does have an authentic Manx tune, i.e. it has been collected. The melody is as it's been collected in the Clegg collection. The tune actually had its own words, "Dew and a jag a keer," about a poor fellow who was pelted with stones or pellets or sods or something. It's not at all like the sort of words we have here, which are very delicate. I think they're horrible, actually. This is my pet hate song. And Phil said, "Oh, please, can I sing it? Because I used to in Arbury School in the 1970s. So just for those of you who have a sentimental need for a few verses."
I'll have you know this was as directed by Ronnie Aldridge, of all people. Everyone will have heard of Ronnie Aldridge, surely. But yes, it was a higher pitch, I remember, when I was singing. Come the fairies now are dancing gaily on the Claddock's green. 'Tis a sight the most entrancing e'er by mortals seen. Happy little people, merry little people, hand in hand they're gaily dancing on the Claddock's green.
Isn't that lovely? Thanks, Phil. That one I could do without. Shooting forward in time from the collectors and those collections of the 1890s to times closer to our own, mind you, they still seem quite a long way away now, 1970s and 1980s, when thanks to Colin Jerry and Crystal Jerry and the small group of people meeting at the it wasn't the White House then, was it? It was the Thai Bower. It was what's its proper name? The Central. That's it. They were meeting at the Central and playing some music, and this was Colin and Crystal were looking very carefully at the Clegg collections, the manuscript collections from Dr. Clegg and Gill. They were looking at A.W. Moore's songs, which had words, and thinking, some of us know some Manx, let's go for it. And they produced the little red book and the little yellow book, which were like the Bible of Manx music for certainly when I was in my 20s. And indeed, the whole Clegg collection, plus music from other people, is contained here in Culture Vannin. And this is what you might call raw music. It doesn't tell you how to play it. Doesn't sort of suggest what chords you should use in this. It's just up to you. So I suppose it's a resource book. I'm happier with that, I have to say. But there you go. Okay, Phil, let's have a look at somebody else called Philly. Philly the Desert. Now, he was the go-to fiddler of the 1890s. That's the A.W. Moore separately. And the Gills went to visit him to get some music from him. And he was a larger-than-life character, and he was the most famous of them all. Here's a quote from W.H. Gill about what it was like when they went to visit him. "We were sitting in the cart shed, and a horse cloth spread over heaps of dried bracken afforded a homely couch in perfect keeping with the rustic surroundings. Later, Philly was described by James Cowell, who came from the area. A lot of people looked upon Philly as an oddity. In some respects, he might have been, but I thought differently. He was to me both witty, humorous, and wise. All he needed was a little education and an outlet for his genius. He could play the fiddle, sing, dance, and drink beer to further orders. Now, the same man goes on to say that he got the name the Desert because he was living in the place, East Baldwin, which had that name, which presumably was somewhere not easy to cultivate. And the cottage where he lived was a very low one, with only a cockloft reached by a small ladder from a bedroom up against the thatched roof. The cable came close to the road, and only a pigsty was between it. And anyone standing on the sty could reach the chimney. And one night, some youngsters put a live hen down the chimney. They hadn't a clean house at any time, and it wouldn't be improved by that, she said. Well, here's one of the many tunes collected from Philly the Desert, but this one goes by the name of Bol and Ben. It's the doo-doo-doo. Confusingly, there are quite a few tunes called Bol and Ben. And there, of course, is Bol and Ben, the plant, the magic herb. But we have wilting in our buttonholes on July the 5th. Bol and Ben, well, Ben, of course, is white, and the under leaf there is whitish. Bollen, possibly because it's a little round ball, which when the buds are in bloom, they're budding, they're sort of little white balls. I don't know, that might be something to do with it. Fairly inoffensive looking plant, but if you're a farmer or a shepherd or a fiddle player, you'd be well to pay attention to it. For all the stories and tunes of this name are all associated with themselves. And they're much more, as I said before, than any old tune. They are special. They come from all the mountainy places you can imagine where the fairies hang out, and they belong to different parts of the island and indeed to different times of the year. That's the tunes, not the plant. So, listen out if you find yourself on Sleuchan, on Slewdoo, on Sulby Glen, Snaefell, Renas again, Ingebrek, many more places. There's loads of people, loads of notes mentioning places where fairy music has been heard, inland and up mostly, occasionally in valleys. Well, we're going to give you a version of the Bol and Ben story and another spikier sort of Bol and Ben fairy tune, which we've taken from A.W. Moore's Manx ballads. A.W. Moore got it originally from John Cain, who I think was a policeman, and it had been supposedly overheard by a drunk fiddler, of course, on New Year's morning. And the story itself was recited in Manx, of course, but Phil's going to recite it from A.W. Moore's translation into English. Oh, and the tradition of this particular story is that the audience has at intervals to join in. Yes, but don't worry, because the fairies seem to be more interested in the sort of pert bail, the mouth music, the tra-la-la and the fal-de-da sort of stuff, than they are in any sophisticated lyrics in Manx. So fear not, all you have to do is join in at the end bit. When I find it, here we are. So All you have to do is sing ball and ben 3 times, something like this. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben, and a do at the end, so you go up. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben. However, there's a bit more to it than that. You join in if you feel like it. We'll go through, and I'll try and work out how all these diddle dums fit in on the notes, because they don't always. Okay. Right-a-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben.
Saturday morning, the first morning of the year, it was a very snowy morning. I went up to the big mountain to put a little sight on the sheep. The dog ran 3 times round the big mountain, but the dog grew tired. I took the sheep blanket and I put it on his 4 feet. I threw him on my back and I came away home. I was coming down the miry meadow when I heard a noise and I listened. They, themselves, the fairies, were carrying on the big bow, the fiddle.
Right-a-do-da-diddle-do, right-a-do-da-diddle-do, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben.
I threw the dog on me back and I got as far as Sleuchern. Then I threw the dog down off me back and I went to prove the song. Alas, I'd forgotten it. Back with me, they were carrying on the big bow.
Right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-diddle. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben.
I threw the dog on me back and I came away home. I was coming down the Bishop's Court flat. It was the Sunday morning. The sun was shining and I went to prove the song.
Right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben.
I reached home, I threw the dog under the table and I sat down in the big armchair. I went to prove the song when Moll got up and she said, "Poor Paddy, is it Sunday morning that's got thou? Away to bed with thee, Moll," said I, "or I will make the sun shine through thy ribs like a ribbed stocking."
Right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum, right-a-diddle-diddle-dum. Ball and ben, ball and ben, ball and ben. Well, thank you. In another version of that story, there's considerably less throwing of the dog and abuse of the wife, I have to say. In W.H. Gill's story, which isn't told like that, the fiddler, when he goes back to the mountain, takes with him some leaves of ball and ben to keep him safe. Protection. Obviously it worked because he came back and eventually got the tune. So it might be why the fairy tunes got their name, from that idea that you both had protection from them and yet you took them, you were able to deal with them. Okay, here's, when I find it, here's a sample of fairy music you might not have heard before. It's another ball and ben here, and if you've got no fiddle to hand, it doesn't really matter. This tune was collected by the Gill brothers from the singing of, you'll never guess, One Cannel from Kirk Michael village in 1896, when Cannel was about 80. And included by Deemster Gill is a note from one I.W. Lace. And this is what the note says. It's down at the bottom there, but I'll read it. Old Cannel, when he tells the story, finishes by catching up a working stick or the poker, runs this along his arm in imitation of playing the violin, dances and sings vigorously the above air and the syllables, "Damn, damn, the diddle, damn." So perhaps he forgot to wait for the poker to cool, I don't know. Here's the tune. Yes, I have to say that was a new one to me. That was in James de Gill's papers. Okay. Now, a wren is the word in Manx for a song, and faerishin is the word for fairies. And something described as an wren, or in English as a ballad, could equally well be just a rhyme or a poem without a tune. Might have had one at one point. A.W. Moore gives us a really surreal text that mentions just about all the supernatural creatures you really don't want to meet with. No delightful singing mermaids here or rhythmically inclined fairies. These are thugs of the first order. The Tarrowushja. We've got the spotted water bull and the glashton, all happy to grab you. And the normally amenable Faery, he's joining in as well, bashing you up against the wall like a pillow. And then to join the mayhem in this particular song, we've got the legendary hero Finn McCool and all his company, the Fairy of the Glen, and the Begane for good measure, all flinging themselves anew all about, and all the items off the kitchen as well, all the fire irons and the cups and saucers, everything's going flying. Crippy Innican, Slowrias and Dralu, Troggle Susons Kagakai, Majin Fots and the Just and all your Firel, Naira Hay. Majin Fots the Borden Kiaklach, Cresig, Goggin, Just as Clare, all your Kaga, Skridden the San Essex, Trevechu Cledert, Erle. If you're wondering what exactly that was in English, good old A.W. Moore has provided a translation, at least, of some of that. Doesn't mention the flying kitchen utensils. These are the two verses about the Tarrowushja and the Glashton and the Faery. I'm sure you can read those there. And of course, the same text appears in Sophia Morrison's Manx Fairy Tales in the 1929 edition, not the first one, under the title of A Bad Wish. It might indeed, this whole song might indeed be a curse to bring down upon someone who'd been forsaken in love. And in the manuscript of Robert Gawne that A.W. Moore had access to, the words do seem to indicate that somebody, anyway, is very, very angry with somebody else. So that's A Bad Wish, or a song that doesn't have words. We've got lots like that, really. Can we have the next one, Phil? Okay. This is part of a song about a Faery. This time he's calmed down a bit. More typically, he's there as the Fuldagasta, the swift mower. Again, we're in A.W. Moore's Manx ballads. The Faery, I'm sure you know, but he's the hairy creature who's working around the farms on the island. He's a traveller, not the brightest of the bright. And in this song, he appears more as a sort of overzealous gardener of the Curragh, where he goes to raise the dew from the grey morning. And he's there with a scythe to cut the meadow down. But he gets a bit carried away. You wouldn't want to let him loose in a sight of scientific interest. He doesn't care. The lub and the lus and ollie and everything is reduced to tiny stalks. Now, this is the sort of 4 verses. This is the sort of song where you wish there was an original tune, but it's gone. And the verses, as they are incomplete. But I do like the words. I like the words in Manx. They're descriptive. I have made a tune for it. I'm just going to sing you a verse. Normally I do it with the choir, but just gives you an idea. Yeah, so there's me doing the sorts of things that W.H. Gill would probably have no compunction about. If it's not there, make it up. Might to know. And for northery height and laney, the frog all truck the fat and glass, loss of fortune as loss and ollie, they stamp a cast. If you want to hear any more, you'll have to ask Kirk and Kissack to do it. Okay. Now, I think we're on another slide. Are we? Oh, yes. Do you know what that is? It's a glashton. You surely knew that. Yeah. Now, you know that he had his helpful moments, but the glashton, that fearful water spirit, tends not to. And one of the most peculiar songs I've ever had to arrange for the choir to sing, for Kirk and Kissack to sing, actually does have a glashton in its title. It's called a Wren, a Glashton, the Song of the Glashton. And its subtitle is Vad Ions Crank Ali Moor, a night in Crank Ali Moor, which some authorities think is probably Knockalo now. Like most of its supernatural companions, it does cover a fair bit of the island at night. And although this tends to be a fairly Western orientated song, and most of the song consists of lists of place names, and it's talking about the glashton. We think he was a knight at Cronk-Ellen Moor, he was a knight in Cronk-Ellen Beg, a knight in Gurdon Moor, and a knight under Gobna Craig, and it goes on and on and on, adding place names. Now the tune, it's not made up by me, it is in the Clegg collection, and there have been some very interesting commentaries on that and the words over the years. I rather fancied bringing the song to some sort of life with my own choir, but we didn't really have enough words to justify getting people out to listen for 10 seconds a song. So following the pattern that was there, we sat there one Saturday and made up a whole load of place names. Well, we didn't make up place names, we just found place names and put them in the song and left our glashton wandering around. So we've just got a verse from Kirk and Kissack singing the beginning of a Wren, a glashton, the glashton song.
They're all out in the back kitchen.
No, they're not. There's one there. Kind of funny.
Yes, I think it's not connecting to the speaker.
On, oh, the do. Now, whether that's just a sort of chorus or it's something to do with it being very dark out there, black, I don't know. Might it be possible that our glashton... Oh, well, never mind. Oh, no, it's fine. He can carry on. Well, you just carry on. I just about to suggest that maybe our glashton might have liked to join up with some other fairy kind and head off with a band of travelling fairies. But watch this space. We can do it now. Okay. Right, so here, of course, we have the great Sophia Morrison. And really from the beginning of the 20th century, she is going flat out, doing lots and lots of collecting of her own work. From what is often described as fragments, everybody calls them fragments, and they are, in a way. But here she is, Peel woman extraordinary, song and story collector, language activist, writer. She's a producer, she's an encourager, she's a supreme organiser, and she's a fierce Manx patriot. And she's on stage here, of course. If I had time, and I rather hoped I would, but I realised I was going to run out of it if I went too much down the Sophia route. So I was going to talk about her retelling of the traditional story, The Lazy Wife, which appears in her Manx Fairy Tales book, and the magic song that held that story together, that was actually part of the story and advanced the story. But, however, I haven't got time and I'm still on the track of travelling fairies rather than spinning fairies, so I'm going to leave that for now. But Sophia herself was very active in the field of collecting folk song in the West. as I mentioned, and she did come across quite a bit of fairy music, and some had slightly more coherent words, slightly, than some of the other things we've heard about. I'm still trying to work out how to read tonic sol fa so I can turn some of them, actually hear what they sounded like from her own collections, which are quite random. Her papers are quite a lot of different things all put there together, so it's not like you can go straight to the collection particularly easily. Anyway, here in her own words is a story about how she came across the song. She was involved with some of the early technology for recording music and speech at the beginning of the 20th century, when in Cheshire Gilgach, the Manx Language Society, acquired a phonograph, or she calls it a gramophone here, and with some difficulty they'd worked out how to get this to do something, and headed off into the field, as it were, to try and get to record things. So here's a little story in her words, how she got a wren na ferishin gelbi, the song of the Derby faeries, or Tom Billy Hall's song. Right, so Tom Billy Hall, this is Sophia writing, was an old man going on the houses, and he lived in Glen Rushen. And he and his family had long departed. Some had died and some had emigrated. Therefore, I was greatly pleased that I happened to be in a house 2 summers ago when his youngest son walked in to say goodbye. This is the youngest son of Tom Billy Hall. The man, a miner in Arizona, who was home on a very short visit and had worked his passage across on a ship, was leaving the island that day, never to see it more, he said. I invited him to my house and asked him to sing some of his father's songs into the Manx Language Society gramophone. He had only about 20 minutes to spare, but he kindly came with me and sang 2 songs into the horn, one being the song of the Derby or Derby faeries. Unfortunately, Callister, that's the name of the singer, was fearfully nervous and in a hurry to be off. Well, I'm not surprised if you missed the boat to America. It's a bit drastic, isn't it? So there she was collecting there. And we've got some of the words here of the song, which might remind you of something else if you were listening previously to the Glashton song. Ian's pert na hinge, as Ian's ballyrums a, foldy doodly high, doodly ree ho. I'll read it in English now. A night in Peel and a night in Ramsey, a night in St John's and a night in Douglastown. We were in Port Erin and a night in Castletown, and a night at Carnagry and a house in Tom Quirk's house. What would you get there? We got potatoes and pork, and a night in the yard, and a night in the flat green field, and a night in the green peas at the south end of the flat green field. A night in Croncolly Beg, and a night in Croncolly Moor, a night in Girdna Gobna Craig. We got a belly full of cowrie. We went on to Ballabena, and we got plenty of oat bread and a good mile of butter. So there we are, some very hungry fairies. Food seems to be the major motivation. That must have been, if you were one of those farms or places, rather like being visited by a royal retinue and being eaten out of house and home, I think, if that lot appeared. As Sophia herself noted, this song obviously lent itself to local adaptation. Perhaps you could make pointed comments on the variety of fare you might be offered at particular places. The words are more than a little similar to the Glashton song we heard, and I think the tune would probably fit too, so they probably were one and the same song once upon a time. There are newspaper reports of this song, or one very like it, bringing the house down in the course of some Manx readings in Peel. They took place in Sophia Morrison's time, but also earlier in the 1870s. There seems to be an element of riotous performance, almost buffoonery, required to perform some of these fairy songs. I mean, Ball and Ben and the travelling fairies seem to be the particular ones. It was like they no longer, almost as if they no longer carried that mystique they might once have had. reading the reviews in the paper, they sound a bit like sort of musical tunes. Well, we hear no more of Glashtons on the go, but the troops travelling fairies do carry on travelling through the 20th century, but they have taken on different guises. We've got, oh yes, here we are. Here's a little lullaby. How authentic it is disputed, but it's was sung by William Cubban, of course, of the museum director. I don't know if he was a director at the time of this, and he was supposed to have got it from a maid who worked in the household. And again, it's that there's a sort of travelling, it's a lullaby, but there's a mention of places here. I'll just sing the tune because it sort of connects with the next thing. So it's, I think it's 1930s. In the Gliana Balacomish, the Londu will build her nest. Sleep thee, my baby, sleep thee, Baclaich baby, sleep thee, my baby, and I'll get the birdie. Of course, the Londu is the blackbird there. Well, it's a strange sort of thing. And then, several years later, we have a song in Manx from Morrison's protege, Mona Douglas, who I have to say I could do a whole evening on her fairy songs, but she was certainly keen on them, and her enthusiasm for them increased with age. In 1959, she brought out, this is Mona Douglas, she brought out her third Manx song, book of Manx songs with simple piano accompaniment. And Ren, the Sheach and Trolltech, of course, the song of the travelling fairies, a version of the song of the travelling fairies is here again. This time it's a lullaby, and Douglas's and Cubban's song I've just sang broadly share the same sort of tune. There's different rhythms, and there's a theme of travelling fairies, lists of place names, plus added birds. And the birds seem to be some sort of protection against the fairies taking the child. So this is Mona Douglas, translation of Mona Douglas's first verse of her Sheach and Trolltech. It was in the glen of Balacomish where the glowls nest. Sleep, my child, the travelling fairies will come. Hush now, and I'll call on the bird. So we'll just have a bit of that from Kirk Michael, arranged by me. So it's very different from the rioters jumping around in parish halls some years before. Well, Mona, of course, will always be open to the charge of making things up, but she wouldn't be the first, and many of us do. But I was highly delighted about 20 years ago, still in relation to these travelling fairies songs, to hear the late Johnny Crellin describe how he'd heard someone calling round at his farm, and the person had a rhyme on very similar lines about fairies in the north of the island, travelling round all the farms there, and it named the farms, and those names were all local to a small area. And it was wartime, as late as wartime when he heard this, and he said, it was at Craig Nishman who was telling us this, he said at the time he'd scribbled the words down on a cement sack. So the question is, where is that cement sack? But we don't know, but it's one of these rather nice mysteries that makes these things interesting. Okay. Can we go on, Phil? Yeah, good. Okay, you'll probably know these fellas. You certainly know the Gow, the native speaker there, and Leslie Quirk on the right. In 1949, Leslie was one of the group of people who went round collecting material from the last of the native speakers of Manx. And about 15 years later, Yeah, Leslie, amongst many other things, was teaching night school. He was teaching Manx in Douglas, and my mum went along at first and took us, because there was no babysitters in those days. And at the ends of the lessons, I have to say, we didn't really understand the lessons, quite young, but at the end, he would come and chat to us, the children, me and Jenny, and he taught me this rhyme. And I think he said that he got it from the native speakers, but when I tried to look through the lists of rhymes, I couldn't find it, so I might have made this up. I haven't made up the words. I might have made up he got it from the native speakers. It's not very much of a thing. It doesn't have any tune, but it fits the theme. When I went out at break of day, as I went over the mountains, I came on the little people who were walking the roads and dancing. They never give up, do they? I put it to the tune of, a tune known as Gurnenim, without a name. It's an Irish tune, really, because I thought it went for it. It's a bit jollier than some of these lullabies, so we'll do it now. Mahaimi ma cheprishule, mahaimi harish na sledgen, mahaimi na dayan you beg of a chulna redness downland, as Falco riddle and tiddle and tansy tay, mahaimi ma cheprishule, mahaimi harish na sledgen. There you go, that's what it is. Nearly finished. Okay, well, we've nearly finished. The Derby song, or Delby song, I've had that many people telling me different ways of doing it. I hedge my bets and say all three. It was noted down by Sophia Morrison again and appeared in her journal Mannin in 1913. And this song, Ren Gelby, has a very different sort of melody to those you've heard earlier, and it's not associated with lots of trooping fairies or weird people like that. However, it is mysterious. It might best fit the idea of the beautiful music encountered if you wander into the fairy world. And unlike the other tunes you've heard, it's not a jig or a reel or an obvious candidate for a song. Perhaps a little more like the first reference to fairy music I mentioned in relation to the mermaid at the beginning, possibly. Very much associated with the sea anyway. Though I have to say I have heard an old Carvel tune which sounds a little bit like it. Now, although this is described as an Aren, a song, I haven't seen any ancient Manx words to go with it. There are some words from about 100 years ago, but not traditional ones in any way. Just before we hear it from Phil, this is how this story and song are described in Mannin in 1913. In the long ago, a curiously shaped boat would be seen at the close of a summer evening, coming from Brada towards Delby. In the boat sat an old man with long white hair, who rowed until off Niable Point. Then he rested on his oars and sang this melody, which runs up and down the minor scale with the lilt of the waves. And as the thing became known, the people would come and stay on the shore to listen to the music, for it was very sweet to them. But his boat was far off, and no words could be distinguished. When the old man had made an end of the song, he rowed southwestward till he was seen no more, and no one knew whence he came, nor whither he went, nor who he was. But the people of Dalby knew his song and taught it to their children's children. So this is Aren Gelb. you. I was going to do another one, but I think that was such a lovely ending. We will float off we will row off to the west into the sunset. And thank you, Phil, very much for helping me. As good am I